The situation demanded instant action, and in order that the import of Jackson's movements may be fully realized, it is necessary to turn to the main theatre of war. McClellan, on April 5th, with the 60,000 men already landed, had moved a few miles up the peninsula. Near the village of Yorktown, famous for the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and his army in 1782, he found the road blocked by a line of earthworks and numerous guns. Magruder, Jackson's captain in Mexico, was in command, but Johnston was still on the Rapidan, 130 miles away, and the Confederates had no more than 15,000 men in position. The flanks, however, were secured by the York and the James rivers, which here expand to wide estuaries, and the works were strong. Yorktown proved almost as fatal to the invaders as to their English predecessors. Before the historic lines, their march was suddenly brought up. McClellan, although his army increased in numbers every day, declined the swift process of a storm. Personal reconnaissance convinced him that instant assault would have been simple folly, and he determined to besiege the entrenchments in due form. On April 10th, Johnston's army began to arrive at Yorktown, and the lines, hitherto held by a slender garrison, were now manned by 53,000 men. The Confederate position was by no means impregnable. The River James to the south was held by the Merrimac, an improvised ironclad of novel design which had already wrought terrible destruction amongst the wooden frigates of the Federals. She was neutralized, however, by her northern counterpart, the Monitor, and after an indecisive action she had remained inactive for nearly a month. The York was less securely guarded. The channel, nearly a mile wide, was barred only by the fire of two forts, and that at Gloucester Point, on the north bank, was open to assault from the land side. Had McClellan disembarked a detachment and carried this work, which might easily have been done, the river would have been opened to his gunboats, and Johnston's lines have become untenable. He decided, however, notwithstanding that his army was more than 100,000 strong, that he had no men to spare for such an enterprise. Magruder's bold stand was of infinite service to the Confederate cause. To both parties, time was of the utmost value. The Federals were still over 70 miles from Richmond, and there was always a possibility, if their advance were not rapidly pressed, that Johnston might move on Washington and cause the recall of the army to protect the capital. The Confederates, on the other hand, had been surprised by the landing of McClellan's army. They had been long aware that the flotilla had sailed, but they had not discovered its destination. The detachments which first landed were supposed to be reinforcements for the garrison of the fortress. And when McClellan advanced on Yorktown, Johnston was far to the west of Richmond. The delay had enabled him to reach the lines. But at the time Jackson fell back to Elk Run Valley, April 17th to 19, fortune seemed inclining to the Federals. Lincoln had been induced to relax his hold on the Army Corps which he had held back at Manassas to protect the capital, and McDowell was already moving on Fredericksburg, 60 miles north of Richmond. Here he was to be joined by Shields, bringing his force for the field up to 40,000 men, and the fall of Yorktown was to be the signal for his advance on the Confederate capital. Johnston still held the lines, but he was outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, and the enemy was disembarking heavy ordnance. It was evident that the end could not be long delayed, and that in case of retreat, every single Confederate soldier, from the valley and elsewhere, would have to be brought to Richmond for the decisive battle. Jackson was thus bound to his present position, close to the railway, and his orders from Johnston confined him to a strictly defensive attitude. In case Banks advanced eastward, he was to combine with Ewell and receive attack in the passes of the Blue Ridge. Such cautious strategy, to one so fully alive to the opportunity offered by McClellan's retention before Yorktown, was by no means acceptable. When his orders reached him, Jackson was already weaving plans for the discomfiture of his immediate adversary, and it may be imagined with what reluctance, although he gave no vent to his chagrin, he accepted the passive role which had been assigned to him. No sooner, however, had he reached Elk Run Valley than the telegraph brought most welcome news. In a moment of unwonted wisdom, the Confederate President had charged General Lee with the control of all military operations in Virginia, and on April 21st came a letter to Jackson which foreshadowed the downfall of McClellan and the rout of the invaders. April 21st, McDowell's advance from Manassas had already become known to the Confederates, and Lee had divined what this movement portended. "I have no doubt," he wrote to Jackson, "that an attempt will be made to occupy Fredericksburg and use it as a base of operations against Richmond. Our present force there is very small, 2,500 men under General Field, and cannot be reinforced except by weakening other corps. If you can use General Ewell's division in an attack on Banks, it will prove a great relief to the pressure on Fredericksburg." This view of the situation was in exact agreement with Jackson's own views. He had already made preparation for combined action with Ewell. For some days they had been in active correspondence. The exact route which Ewell should take to the Blue Ridge had been decided on. The roads had been reconnoitred. Jackson had supplied a map identical with his own, and had furnished an officer to act as guide. A service of couriers had been established across the mountains, and no precaution had been neglected. Ewell was instructed to bring 5 days' rations. He was warned that there would be no necessity for a forced march. He was to encamp at crossroads, and he was to rest on Sunday. April 23rd. Jackson, replying to Lee, stated that he was only waiting a favourable occasion to fall on Banks. "My object," he wrote, "has been to get in his rear at New Market or Harrisonburg, if he gives me an opportunity, and this would be the case should he advance on Staunton with his main body. It appears to me that if I remain quiet a few days more, he will probably make a move in some direction, or send a large force towards Harrisonburg, and thus enable me, with the blessing of Providence, to successfully attack his advance. If I am unsuccessful in driving back his entire force, he may be induced to move forward from New Market and attempt to follow me through this gap, where our forces would have greatly the advantage. Under all the circumstances, I will direct General Ewell to move to Stanardsville. Should Banks remain in the position of yesterday, cavalry at Harrisonburg, infantry, etc. at New Market, I will try and seek an opportunity of attacking successfully some part of his army, and if circumstances justify, press forward. My instructions from General Johnston were to unite with General Ewell near the top of the Blue Ridge and give battle. The course I propose would be departing from General Johnston's instructions, but I do not believe that Banks will follow me to the Blue Ridge unless I first engage him, and I doubt whether he will then. But although authorized to draw Ewell to himself and to carry out the project on which his heart was set, he still kept in view the general situation. After he had dispatched the above letter, a report came in which led him to believe that Ewell was more needed on the Rappahannock than in the valley. Lee had already informed him that McDowell's advanced guard had occupied Falmouth, on the north bank of the river, opposite Fredericksburg, on April 19th, and that General Field had fallen back. Jackson, in consequence, permitted Ewell to remain near Gordonsville, close to the railway, assuring Lee that he would make arrangements so as not to be disappointed should Ewell be ordered to Fredericksburg. Nor was this the only instance in which he demonstrated his breadth of view. In planning cooperation with Ewell, that general had suggested that he should take a different road to that which had been recommended by General Johnston, should necessity for a combined movement arise. Jackson protested against the route being altered. "General Johnston," he wrote, "does not state why he desires you to go by this road, but it may be for the purpose of deceiving the enemy with regard to your ultimate destination, to be more distant from the enemy during the movement, and also to be in a more favourable position for reinforcing some other points should it be necessary." The interests of his own force, here as always, were subordinated to those of the army which was defending Richmond. April 25th. The next information received from General Lee was that the enemy was collecting in strong force at Fredericksburg. "For this purpose," he wrote, "they must weaken other points, and now is the time to concentrate on any that may be exposed within our reach." He then suggested that, if Banks was too strong in numbers and position, Jackson and Ewell combined should move on Warrenton, where a federal force was reported, or that Ewell and Field should attack Fredericksburg. The blow, he added, wherever struck must, to be successful, be sudden and heavy. The troops must be efficient and light. I cannot pretend at this distance to direct operations depending on circumstances unknown to me and requiring the exercise of discretion and judgment as to time and execution, but submit these ideas for your consideration. April 26th. On April 26th, when Banks moved 2 brigades to Harrisonburg, Ewell was at once called up to Stannardsville, 12 miles southeast of Swift Run Gap. No opportunity as yet had offered for attack. "I have reason to believe," wrote Jackson to Lee on the 28th, "that Banks has 21,000 men within a day's march of me. He has moved his main body from Newmarket to Harrisonburg, leaving probably a brigade at Newmarket, and between that town and the Shenandoah, Luray Gap, to guard against a force getting in his rear. On yesterday week there were near 7,000 men in the neighbourhood of Winchester under Blenker. As yet I have not heard of their having joined Banks. I propose to attack Banks in front if you will send me 5,000 more men. Now, as it appears to me, is the golden opportunity for striking a blow. Until I hear from you, I will watch an opportunity for striking some exposed point." April 29th. The next day, April 29th, Jackson suggested, if reinforcements could not be spared, that one of 3 plans should be adopted. Either to leave Ewell here, Swift Run Gap, to threaten Banks's rear in the event of his advancing on Staunton, and move with my command rapidly on the force in front of General Edward Johnson, or else, cooperating with Ewell, to attack the enemy's detached force between Newmarket and the Shenandoah, and if successful in this, then to press forward and get in Banks's rear at Newmarket, and thus induce him to fall back. The third is to pass down the Shenandoah to Sperryville, east of the Blue Ridge, and thus threaten Winchester via Front Royal. To get in Banks's rear with my present force would be rather a dangerous undertaking, as I would have to cross the river and immediately cross the Massanutten Mountains, during which the enemy would have the advantage of position. Of the 3 plans, I give the preference to attacking the force west of Staunton, Milroy, for if successful, I would afterward only have Banks to contend with, and in doing this would be reinforced by General Edward Johnson, and by that time you might be able to give me reinforcements which, united with the troops under my control, would enable me to defeat Banks. If he should be routed and his command destroyed, nearly all our own forces here could, if necessary, cross the Blue Ridge to Warrenton, Fredericksburg, or any other threatened point. Lee's reply was to the effect that no reinforcements could be spared, but that he had carefully considered the 3 plans of operations proposed, and that the selection was left to Jackson. The Army of the Valley, when the Commander-in-Chief's letter was received, had already been put in motion. 3 roads lead from Conrad's store in the Elk Run Valley to Johnson's position at West View, one through Harrisonburg, the second by Port Republic, Cross Keys, and Mount Sidney, the third, the River Road, by Port Republic and Staunton. The first of these was already occupied by the Federals, the second was tortuous, and at places almost within view of the enemy's camps, while the third, though it was nowhere less than 10 miles distant, ran obliquely across their front. In fact, to all appearance, Banks with his superior force blocked Jackson's march on Staunton more effectively than did Jackson his. On the 29th, Ashby, continually watching Banks, made a demonstration in force towards Harrisonburg. April 30th. On the 30th he drove the Federal cavalry back upon their camps, and the same afternoon Jackson, leaving Elk Run Valley, which was immediately occupied by Ewell with 8,000 men, marched up the river to Port Republic. The track, unmetalled and untended, had been turned into a quagmire by the heavy rains of an ungenial spring, and the troops marched only 5 miles, bivouacking by the roadside. May 1st was a day of continuous rain. The great mountains loomed dimly through the dreary mist. The streams which rushed down the gorges to the Shenandoah had swelled to brawling torrents, and in the hollows of the fields the water stood in sheets. Men and horses floundered through the mud. The guns sunk axle-deep in the treacherous soil, and it was only by the help of large detachments of pioneers that the heavy wagons of the train were able to proceed at all. It was in vain that piles of stones and brushwood were strewn upon the roadway. The quicksands dragged them down as fast as they were placed. The utmost exertions carried the army no more than 5 miles forward, and the troops bivouacked once more in the dripping woods. May 2nd. The next day, the 3rd in succession, the struggle with the elements continued. The whole command was called upon to move the guns and wagons. The general and his staff were seen dismounted, urging on the labourers, and Jackson, his uniform bespattered with mud, carried stones and timbers on his own shoulders. But before nightfall the last ambulance had been extricated from the slough, and the men, drenched to the skin and worn with toil, found a halting place on firmer ground. But this halting place was not on the road to Staunton. Before they reached Port Republic, instead of crossing the Shenandoah and passing through the village, the troops had been ordered to change the direction of their march. The spot selected for their bivouac was at the foot of Brown's Gap, not more than 12 miles southwest of the camp in Elk Run Valley. May 3rd. The next morning the clouds broke. The sun, shining with summer warmth, ushered in a glorious May day, and the column, turning its back upon the valley, took the stony road that led over the Blue Ridge. Upward and eastward the battalions passed, the great forest of oak and pine rising high on either hand, until from the eyrie of the mountain eagles they looked down upon the wide Virginia plains. Far off, away to the southeast, the trails of white smoke from passing trains marked the line of the Central Railroad, and the line of march led directly to the station at Meckham's River. Both officers and men were more than bewildered. Save to his adjutant general, Jackson had breathed not a whisper of his plan. The soldiers only knew that they were leaving the valley, and leaving it in the enemy's possession. Winchester, Strasburg, Front Royal, New Market, Harrisonburg were full of Northern troops. Staunton alone was yet unoccupied. But Staunton was closely threatened, and north of Harrisonburg the blue-coated cavalry were riding far and wide. While the women and old men looked impotently on, village and mill and farm were at the mercy of the invaders. Already the federal commissaries had laid hands on herds and granaries. It is true that the Northerners waged war like gentlemen, yet for all that the patriotism of the Valley soldiers was sorely tried. They were ready to go to Richmond if the time had come. But it was with heavy hearts that they saw the Blue Ridge rise behind them, and the bivouac on Meckham's River was even more cheerless than the sodden woods near Port Republic. The long lines of cars that awaited them at the station but confirmed their anticipations. They were evidently wanted at the capital, and the need was pressing. Still not a word transpired as to their destination. May 4th. The next day was Sunday, and Jackson had intended that the troops should rest. But early in the morning came a message from Edward Johnston. Fremont's advanced guard was pushing forward. After hard debate with himself, says Dabney, who accompanied him, and with sore reluctance, Jackson once more sacrificed his scruples and ordered the command to march. The infantry was to move by rail, the artillery and wagons by road. To their astonishment and delight, the troops then heard, for the first time, that their destination was not Richmond but Staunton, and although they were far from understanding the reason for their circuitous march, they began to suspect that it had not been made without good purpose. If the soldiers had been heavy-hearted at the prospect of leaving the valley, the people of Staunton had been plunged into the direst grief. For a long time past, they had lived in a pitiable condition of uncertainty. On April 19th, the sick and convalescent of the Valley Army had been removed to Gordonsville. On the same day, Jackson had moved to Elk Run Valley, leaving the road from Harrisonburg completely open, and Edward Johnson evacuated his position on the Shenandoah Mountain. Letters from Jackson's officers, unacquainted with the designs of their commander, had confirmed the apprehension that the Federals were too strong to be resisted. On the Saturday of this anxious week had come the news that the army was crossing the Blue Ridge and that the valley had been abandoned to the enemy. Sunday morning was full of rumours and excitement. 10,000 Federals, it was reported, were advancing against Johnston at Westview. Banks was moving from Harrisonburg. His cavalry had been seen from the neighbouring hills, and Staunton believed that it was to share the fate of Winchester. Suddenly a train full of soldiers steamed into the station, and as regiment after regiment, clad in their own Confederate grey, swept through the crowded streets, confidence in Stonewall Jackson began once more to revive. Pickets were immediately posted on all the roads leading to Harrisonburg, and beyond the line of sentries, no one, whatever his business might be, was allowed to pass. The following day, the remainder of the division arrived, and the junction with Johnston's brigade was virtually effected. May 6th was spent in resting the troops, in making the arrangements for the march, and in getting information. May 7. The next morning brought a fresh surprise to both troops and townsfolk. Banks, so the rumour went, was rapidly approaching, and it was confidently expected that the twin hills which stand above the town, christened by some early settler after two similar heights in faraway Tyrone, Betsy Bell and Mary Grey, would look down upon a bloody battle. But instead of taking post to defend the town, the valley regiments filed away over the western hills, heading for the Alleghenies, and Staunton was once more left unprotected. Jackson, although informed by Ashby that Banks, so far from moving forward, was actually retiring on New Market, was still determined to strike first at Milroy, commanding Fremont's advanced guard, and there can be little question but that his decision was correct. As we have seen, he was under the impression that Banks's strength was 21,000, a force exceeding the united strength of the Confederates by 4,200 men. It was undoubtedly sound strategy to crush the weaker and more exposed of the enemy's detachments first, and then, having cleared his own rear and prevented all chance of combination between Banks and Fremont, to strike the larger. There was nothing to be feared from Harrisonburg. 8 days had elapsed since Jackson had marched from Elk Run, but Banks was still in blissful ignorance of the blow that threatened Fremont's advanced guard. On April 28th, he had telegraphed to Washington that he was entirely secure. Everything was satisfactory. "The enemy," he said, "is in no condition for offensive movements. Our supplies have not been in so good condition, nor my command in so good spirits, since we left Winchester." General Hatch, commanding cavalry, made a reconnaissance in force yesterday, which resulted in obtaining a complete view of the enemy's position. A Negro employed in Jackson's tent came in this morning, and reports preparation for retreat of Jackson today. You need have no apprehensions for our safety. I think we are just now in a condition to do all you can desire of us in the valley, clear the enemy out permanently. On the 30th, when Ashby repaid with interest Hatch's reconnaissance in force, he reported, "All quiet. Some alarm excited by movement of enemy's cavalry. It appears today that they were in pursuit of a Union prisoner who escaped to our camp. The day he left Jackson was to be reinforced by Johnston and attack via Luray. Another report says Jackson is bound for Richmond. This is the fact, I have no doubt. Jackson is on half rations, his supplies having been cut off by our advance. There is nothing to be done in this valley this side of Strasburg." The same night, after full consultation with all leading officers, he repeated that his troops were no longer required in the valley, and suggested to the Secretary of War that he should be permitted to cross the Blue Ridge and clear the whole country north of Gordonsville. Enemy's force there is far less than represented in newspapers, not more than 20,000 at the outside. Jackson's army is reduced, demoralized, on half rations. They are all concentrating for Richmond. I am now satisfied that it is the most safe and effective disposition for our corps. I pray your favourable consideration. Such order will electrify our force." The force was certainly to be electrified, but the impulse was not to come from Mr. Secretary Stanton. Banks, it may have been observed, whenever his superiors wanted him to move, had invariably the best of reasons for halting. At one time, supplies were most difficult to arrange for. At another time, the enemy was being reinforced, and his own numbers were small. But when he was told to halt, he immediately panted to be let loose. The enemy was not half so strong as had been reported. His men were never in better condition. Supplies were plentiful. It is not impossible that Mr. Stanton had by this time discovered, as was said of a certain Confederate general, a protégé of the President, that Banks had a fine career before him until Lincoln undertook to make of him what the good Lord hadn't, a great general. To the daring propositions of the late Governor and Speaker, the only reply vouchsafed was an order to fall back on Strasburg and to transfer Shields' division to General McDowell at Fredericksburg. But on May 3rd, the day Jackson disappeared behind the Blue Ridge, Banks, to his evident discomfiture, found that his adversary had not retreated to Richmond after all. The dashing commander, just now so anxious for one thing or the other, either to clear the valley or to sweep the country north of Gordonsville, disappeared. The reduced, demoralized enemy assumed alarming proportions. Nothing was said about his half-rations, and as Ewell had reached Swift Run Gap with a force estimated at 12,000 men, while Jackson, according to the Federal scouts, was still near Port Republic, Banks thought it impossible to divide his force with safety. Stanton's reply is not on record, but it seems that he permitted Banks to retain Shields until he arrived at Strasburg. And on May 5th, the Federals fell back to Newmarket, their commander, misled both by his cavalry and his spies, believing that Jackson had marched to Harrisonburg. On the 7th, the day that Jackson moved west from Staunton, Banks' fears again revived. He was still anxious that Shields should remain with him. "Our cavalry," he said, "from near Harrisonburg report tonight that Jackson occupies that town, and that he has been largely reinforced. Deserters confirm reports of Jackson's movements in this direction." Jackson's movements at this juncture are full of interest. Friend and foe were both mystified. Even his own officers might well ask why, in his march to Staunton, he deliberately adopted the terrible road to Port Republic. From Elk Run Valley, a metalled road passed over the Blue Ridge to Gordonsville. Staunton by this route was 24 miles further than by Port Republic, but there were no obstacles to rapid marching, and the command would have arrived no later than it actually did. Moreover, in moving to Port Republic, 11 miles only from Harrisonburg, and within sight of the enemy's patrols, it would seem that there was considerable risk. Had Banks attacked the bridge whilst the Confederate artillery was dragging heavily through the mire, the consequences would probably have been unpleasant. Even if he had not carried the bridge, the road which Jackson had chosen ran for several miles over the open plain which lies eastward of the Shenandoah, and from the commanding bluffs on the western bank, his column could have been effectively shelled without the power of reply. In moving to Staunton, the Confederate commander had 3 objects in view. 1. To strengthen his own force by combining with Edward Johnson. 2. To prevent the Federals combining by keeping Banks stationary and defeating Milroy. 3. To protect Staunton. The real danger that he had to guard against was that Banks, taking advantage of his absence from the valley, should move on Staunton. Knowing his adversary as well as he did, he had no reason to apprehend attack during his march to Port Republic, but it was not impossible that when he found out that Jackson had vanished from the valley, Banks might take heart and join hands with Milroy. It was necessary, therefore, in order to prevent Banks moving, that Jackson's absence from the valley should be very short. Also, in order to prevent Milroy either joining Banks or taking Staunton, that Edward Johnson should be reinforced as rapidly as possible. These objects would be attained by making use of the road to Port Republic. In the first place, Banks would not dare to move towards Milroy so long as the flank of his line of march was threatened, and in the second place, from Port Republic to Staunton, by Meckham's River, was little more than 2 days' march. Within 48 hours, therefore, using the railway, it would be possible to strengthen Johnson in time to protect Staunton, and to prevent the Federals uniting. It was unlikely that Banks, even if he heard at once that his enemy had vanished, would immediately dash forward, and even if he did, he would still have 25 miles to march before he reached Staunton. Every precaution had been taken, too, that he should not hear of the movement across the Blue Ridge till it was too late to take advantage of it, and, as we have already seen, so late as May 5th, he believed that Jackson was at Harrisonburg. Ashby had done his work well. It might be argued, however, that with an antagonist so supine as Banks, Jackson might have openly marched to Staunton by the most direct route. In fact, that he need never have left the valley at all. But had he taken the road across the valley, he would have advertised his purpose. Milroy would have received long warning of his approach, and all chance of effecting a surprise would have been lost. On April 29th, the day on which Jackson began his movement, Richmond was still safe. The Yorktown lines were intact, held by the 53,000 Confederates under Johnston, but it was very evident that they could not be long maintained. A large siege train had been brought from Washington, and Johnston had already learned that in a few days 100 pieces of the heaviest ordnance would open fire on his position. His own armament was altogether inadequate to cope with such ponderous metal. His strength was not half his adversary's, and he had determined to retreat without waiting to have his works demolished. But the mighty army in his front was not the only danger. McDowell, with 35,000 men, had already concentrated near Falmouth. Johnston, in falling back on Richmond, was in danger of being caught between two fires, for to oppose McDowell on the Rappahannock, Lee had been unable to assemble more than 12,000 Confederates. These facts were all known to Jackson. Whether the march to Meckham's River was intended by him to have any further effect on the Federals than surprising Milroy and clearing the way for an attack on Banks, it is impossible to say. It is indisputable at the same time that his sudden disappearance from the valley disturbed Mr. Stanton. The Secretary of War had suspected that Jackson's occupation of Swift Run Gap meant mischief. McDowell, who had been instructed to cross the Rappahannock, was ordered in consequence to stand fast at Falmouth, and was warned that the enemy, amusing McClellan at Yorktown, might make a sudden dash on either himself or Banks. A few days later, McDowell reported that Jackson had passed Gordonsville. The news came from deserters, very intelligent men. The next day he was informed that Shields was to be transferred to his command, and that he was to bear in mind his instructions as to the defence of Washington. Banks had already been ordered back to Strasburg. Now, a few days previously, Stanton had been talking of cooperation between McClellan and McDowell. Directly he learned that Jackson was east of the Blue Ridge, all thought of combination was abandoned. McDowell was held back. Shields was sent to reinforce him, and the possible danger to Washington overrode all other considerations. The weak point of McClellan's strategy was making itself felt. In advancing on Richmond by way of the peninsula, he had deliberately adopted what are called in strategy the exterior lines. That is, his forces were distributed on the arc of a circle, of which Richmond and the Confederate army were the centre. If, landing on the peninsula, he had been able to advance at once upon Richmond, the enemy must have concentrated for the defence of his capital, and neither Banks nor Washington would have been disturbed. But the moment his advance was checked, as it was at Yorktown, the enemy could detach at his leisure in any direction that he pleased, and McClellan was absolutely unable to support the threatened point. The strategy of exterior lines demands, for success, a strong and continuous pressure on the enemy's main army, depriving him of the time and the space necessary for counterstroke. If this is impossible, a skillful foe will at once make use of his central position. Lincoln appears to have had an instinctive apprehension that McClellan might not be able to exert sufficient pressure to hold Johnston fast, and it was for this reason that he had fought so strongly against the peninsular line of invasion. It was the probability that the Confederates would use their opportunity with which Stanton had now to deal, complicated by the fact that their numbers were believed to be much greater than they really were. Still, the problem was not one of insurmountable difficulty. Banks and Fremont united had 40,000 men, McDowell over 30,000. A few marches would have brought these forces into combination. Banks and Fremont, occupying Staunton and moving on Gordonsville, would have soon taken up communication with McDowell. An army 70,000 strong, far larger than any force the Confederates could detach against it, would have threatened Richmond from the north and west, and at the same time would have covered Washington. This plan, though not without elements of danger, offered some advantages. Nor were soldiers wanting to advise it. Both Rosecrans and Shields had submitted schemes for such a combination. Mr. Stanton, however, preferred to control the chessboard by the light of unaided wisdom, and while McDowell was unnecessarily strengthened, both Banks and Fremont were dangerously weakened. The only single point where the Secretary showed the slightest sagacity was in apprehending that the Confederates would make use of their opportunity and overwhelm one of the detachments he had so ingeniously isolated. On April 29th, Johnston proposed to Davis that his army should be withdrawn from the peninsula and that the North should be invaded by way of the valley. Lee, in the name of the President, replied that some such scheme had been for some time under consideration, and the burden of his letters, as we have seen, both to Ewell and Jackson, was that a sudden and heavy blow should be struck at some exposed portion of the invading armies. Mr. Stanton was so far right, but where the blow was to be struck, he was absolutely unable to divine. "It is believed," he writes to the Assistant Secretary on May 8th, "that a considerable force has been sent toward the Rappahannock and Shenandoah to move on Washington. Jackson is reinforced strongly. Telegraph McDowell, Banks, and Hartsuff at Warrenton to keep a sharp lookout. Tell General Hitchcock to see that the force around Washington is in proper condition." It was indeed unfortunate for the North that at this juncture the military affairs of the Confederacy should have been placed in the hands of the clearest-sighted soldier in America. It was an unequal match, Lincoln and Stanton against Lee, and the stroke that was to prove the weakness of the Federal strategy was soon to fall. On May 7th, Jackson westward marched in the following order. Edward Johnson's regiments led the way, several miles in advance. The 3rd and 2nd Brigades followed. The Stonewall, under General Winder, a young West Point officer of exceptional promise, bringing up the rear. "The corps of cadets of the Virginia Military Institute," says Dabney, was also attached to the expedition, and the spruce equipments and exact drill of the youths, as they stepped out full of enthusiasm to take their first actual look upon the horrid visage of war under their renowned professor, formed a strong contrast with the war-worn and nonchalant veterans who composed the army. 18 miles west of Staunton, a Federal picket was overrun, and in the pass leading to the Shenandoah Mountain, Johnson captured a camp that had just been abandoned. The Federal rearguard fired a few shells, and the Confederates went into bivouac. Johnson had marched 14 and Jackson 20 miles. That night Milroy concentrated his whole brigade of 3,700 men at McDowell, a little village at the foot of the Bull Pasture Mountain, and sent back in haste for reinforcements. Fremont's command was much strung out. When Milroy had moved from Cheat Mountain through Monterey, 12 miles west of McDowell, the remainder of the army had started up the South Branch Valley to reinforce him. But snowstorms and heavy rains had much delayed the march, and Schenk's brigade had not advanced beyond Franklin, 34 miles north of McDowell. Fremont himself, with a couple of battalions, was approaching Petersburg, 35 miles from Franklin, and Blenker's division, still further to the rear, had not yet quitted Romney. May 8th. On the following morning, to quote from Jackson's report, the march was resumed, General Johnson's brigade still in front. The head of the column was halted near the top of Bull Pasture Mountain, and General Johnson, accompanied by a party of 30 men and several officers, with a view to a reconnaissance of the enemy's position, ascended Sitlington's Hill, an isolated spur on the left of the turnpike, and commanding a full view of the village of McDowell. From this point the position and to some extent the strength of the enemy could be seen. In the valley in which McDowell is situated was observed a considerable force of infantry. To the right, on a height, were 2 regiments, but too distant for an effective fire to that point. Almost a mile in front was a battery supported by infantry. The enemy, observing a reconnoitring party, sent a small body of skirmishers, which was promptly met by the men with General Johnston and driven back. For the purpose of securing the hill, all of General Johnston's regiments were sent to him. Jackson had no intention of delivering a direct assault on the Federal position. The ground was altogether unfavourable for attack. The hill on which his advanced guard was now established was more than 2 miles broad from east to west. But it was no plateau. Rugged and precipitous ridges towered high above the level, and numerous ravines, hidden by thick timber, seamed the surface of the spur. To the front, a slope of smooth, unbroken greensward dropped sharply down, and 500 feet below, behind a screen of woods, the Bull Pasture River ran swiftly through its narrow valley. On the river banks were the Federals, and beyond the valley the wooded mountains, a very labyrinth of hills, rose high and higher to the west. To the right was a deep gorge, nearly half a mile across from cliff to cliff, dividing Sitlington's Hill from the heights to northward, and through this dangerous defile ran the turnpike, eventually debouching on a bridge which was raked by the Federal guns. To the left the country presented exactly the same features. Mountain after mountain, ridge after ridge, cleft by shadowy crevasses, and clothed with great tracts of forest, rolled back in tortuous masses to the backbone of the Alleghanies, a narrow pass, leading due westward, marking the route to Monterey and the Ohio River. Although commanded by Sitlington's Hill, the Federal position was difficult to reach. The river, swollen by rain, protected it in front. The bridge could only be approached by a single road, with inaccessible heights on either hand. The village of McDowell was crowded with troops and guns. A low hill 500 yards beyond the bridge was occupied by infantry and artillery. Long lines of tents were ranged on the level valley, and the hum of many voices, excited by the appearance of the enemy, was borne upwards to the heights. Had the Confederate artillery been brought to the brow of Sitlington's Hill, the valley would doubtless soon have become untenable, and the enemy have been compelled to retire through the mountains. It was by no means easy, however, to prevent them from getting away unscathed. But Jackson was not the man to leave the task untried, and to content himself with a mere cannonade. He had reason to hope that Milroy was ignorant of his junction with General Johnston, and that he would suppose he had only the 6 regiments of the latter with which to deal. The day was far spent, and the valley brigades, toiling through the mountains, were still some miles behind. He proposed, therefore, while his staff explored the mountains for a track which might lead him the next day to the rear of the Federal position, merely to hold his ground on Sitlington's Hill. His immediate opponent, however, was a general of more resource and energy than Banks. Milroy was at least able to supply himself with information. On May 7th, he had been advised by his scouts and spies that Jackson and Johnston had combined, and that they were advancing to attack him at McDowell. At 10 a.m. the next day, Schenk's brigade arrived from Franklin after a march of 34 miles in 23 hours, and a little later the enemy's scouts were observed on the lofty crest of Sitlington's Hill. The day wore on. The Federal battery, with muzzles elevated and the trails thrust into trenches, threw occasional shells upon the heights, and parties of skirmishers were sent across the river to develop the Confederate strength. Johnston, to whom Jackson had confided the defence of the position, kept his troops carefully concealed, merely exposing sufficient numbers to repel the Federal patrols. Late in the afternoon, a staff officer reported to Jackson that he had discovered a rough mountain track, which, passing through the mountains to the northwest, crossed the Bull Pasture River and came out upon the road between McDowell and Franklin. Orders had just been issued to move a strong detachment of artillery and infantry by this track during the night, when the Federal infantry, who had crossed the bridge under shelter of the woods, advanced in a strong line of battle up the slopes. Their scouts had observed what they believed to be preparations for establishing a battery on the heights, and Milroy and Schenck, with a view of gaining time for retreat, had determined on attack. Johnston had 6 regiments concealed behind the crest, in all about 2,800 men. 2 regiments of the enemy, under 1,000 strong, advanced against his front, and shortly afterwards 3 regiments, bringing the numbers of the attack up to 2,500 rifles, assailed his left. The Ohio and West Virginia regiments, of which the Federal force was composed, fought with the vigour which always characterized the Western troops. The lofty heights held by the Confederates were but an illusory advantage. So steep were the slopes in front that the men, for the most part, had to stand on the crest to deliver their fire, and their line stood out in bold relief against the evening sky. On the other hand, says Dabney, though the Federal troops had to scale the steep acclivity of the hill, they reaped the usual advantage in such cases, resulting from the high firing of the Confederates. The 12th Georgia, holding the centre of Johnston's line, displayed more valour than judgment. Having been advanced at first in front of the crest, they could not be persuaded to retire to the reverse of the ridge, where other regiments found partial protection without sacrificing the efficiency of their fire. Their commander, perceiving their useless exposure, endeavoured again and again to withdraw them. But amidst the roar of the musketry, his voice was lifted up in vain, and when by passing along the ranks he persuaded one wing of the regiment to recede, they rushed again to the front while he was gone to expostulate with the other. A tall Georgia youth expressed the spirit of his comrades when he replied the next day to the question why they did not retreat to the shelter of the ridge. "We did not come all this way to Virginia to run before Yankees." Nor was the courage of the other troops less ardent. The 44th Virginia was placed in reserve, 30 paces in rear of the centre. "After the battle became animated," says the brigadier, "and my attention was otherwise directed, a large number of the 44th quit their position, and, rushing forward, joined the 58th and engaged in the fight, while the balance of the regiment joined some other brigade. By 9 o'clock," says Dabney, "the roar of the struggle had passed away, and the green battlefield reposed under the starlight as calmly as when it had been occupied only by its peaceful herds. Detachments of soldiers were silently exploring the ground for their wounded comrades, while the tired troops were slowly filing off to their bivouac. At midnight the last sufferer had been removed and the last picket posted, and then only did Jackson turn to seek a few hours' repose in a neighbouring farmhouse." The valley of McDowell lay in equal quiet. The campfires of the Federals blazed ostentatiously in long and regular lines, and their troops seemed wrapped in sleep. At 1 o'clock the general reached his quarters and threw himself upon a bed. When his mulatto servant, knowing that he had eaten nothing since morning, came in with food, he said, "I want none, nothing but sleep," and in a few minutes he was slumbering like a healthy child. It seems, however, that the march of the turning column had already been countermanded. Putting himself in his enemy's place, Jackson had foreseen Milroy's movements. If the one could move by night, so could the other, and when he rode out at dawn, the Federals, as he anticipated, had disappeared. The next day he sent a laconic dispatch to Richmond. "God blessed our arms with victory at McDowell yesterday." This announcement was doubtless received by the people of Virginia, as Dabney declares, with peculiar delight. On May 4th, Johnston had evacuated Yorktown. On the 5th he had checked the pursuit at Williamsburg, inflicting heavy losses, but had continued his retreat. On the 9th, Norfolk was abandoned, and on the 11th, the Merrimac, grounding in the James, was destroyed by her commander. The victory of McDowell was the one gleam of brightness athwart all these clouds. It must be admitted, however, that the victory was insignificant. The repulse of 2,500 men by 4,000 was not a remarkable feat, and it would even appear that McDowell might be ranked with the battles of lost opportunities. A vigorous counterstroke would probably have destroyed the whole of the attacking force. The riflemen of the West, however, were not made of the stuff that yields readily to superior force. The fight for the bridge would have been fierce and bloody. Twilight had fallen before the Confederate reinforcements arrived upon the scene, and under such conditions the losses must have been very heavy. But to lose men was exactly what Jackson wished to avoid. The object of his manoeuvres was the destruction not of Frémont's advanced guard, but of Banks's army, and if his numbers were seriously reduced, it would be impossible to attain that end. Fremont's brigades, moreover, protected no vital point. A decisive victory at McDowell would have produced but little effect at Washington. No great results were to be expected from operations in so distant a section of the strategic theatre, and Jackson aimed at nothing more than driving the enemy so far back as to isolate him from Banks. May 9th. The next morning, the small force of cavalry crossed the bridge and rode cautiously through the mountain passes. The infantry halted for some hours in McDowell in order that rations might be issued, but the Federals made 23 miles and were already too far ahead to be overtaken. On the 10th and the 11th, the Confederates made forced marches, but the enemy set fire to the forests on the mountainside, and this desperate measure proved eminently successful. The sky was overcast with volumes of smoke which wrapped every distant object in a veil, impenetrable alike to the eyes and telescopes of the officers. Through this sultry canopy the pursuing army felt its way cautiously, cannonaded by the enemy from every advantageous position, while it was protected from ambuscades only by detachments of skirmishers who scoured the burning woods on either side of the highway. The general, often far in advance of the column in his eagerness to overtake the foe, declared that this was the most adroit expedient to which a retreating army could resort, and that it entailed upon him all the disadvantages of a night attack. By slow approaches, and with constant skirmishing, the Federals were driven back to Franklin village, and the double darkness of the night and the smoke arrested the pursuit. May 12th. On May 12th, Jackson resolved to return to the valley. Fremont, with Blenker's division, was at hand. It was impossible to outflank the enemy's position, and time was precious, for he knew not how soon a new emergency at Fredericksburg or at Richmond might occasion the recall of Ewell, and deprive him of the power of striking an effective blow at Banks. Half the day was granted to the soldiers as a day of rest, to compensate for the Sunday spent in the pursuit, and the following order was issued to the command. I congratulate you on your recent victory at McDowell. I request you to unite with me in thanksgiving to Almighty God for thus having crowned your arms with success, and in praying that he will continue to lead you on from victory to victory until our independence shall be established, and make us that people whose God is the Lord. The chaplains will hold divine service at 10 a.m. on this day in their respective regiments. Shortly after noon, the march to McDowell was resumed. May 15th. On the 15th, the army left the mountains and encamped at Lebanon Springs, on the road to Harrisonburg. The 16th was spent in camp, the Confederate president having appointed a day of prayer and fasting. On the 17th, a halt was made at Mount Solon, and here Jackson was met by Ewell, who had ridden over from Elk Run Valley. Banks had fallen back to Strasburg, and he was now completely cut off from Fremont. On the night of the engagement at McDowell, Captain Hotchkiss had been ordered back to the valley, and, accompanied by a squadron of Ashby's cavalry, had blocked the passes by which Fremont could cross the mountains and support his colleague. Bridges and culverts were destroyed, rocks rolled down, and in one instance trees were felled along the road for nearly a mile. Jackson's object was thus thoroughly achieved. All combination between the Federal columns, except by long and devious routes, had now been rendered impracticable, and there was little fear that in any operations down the valley his own communications would be endangered. The McDowell expedition had neutralized, for the time being, Fremont's 20,000 men, and Banks was now isolated, exposed to the combined attack of Jackson, Ewell, and Edward Johnson. One incident remains to be mentioned. During the march to Mount Solon, some companies of the 27th Virginia, who had volunteered for 12 months and whose time had expired, demanded their discharge. On this being refused, as the Conscription Act was now in force, they threw down their arms and refused to serve another day. Colonel Grigsby referred to the general for instructions. Jackson's face, when the circumstances were explained, set hard as flint. "Why," he said, Does Colonel Grigsby refer to me to learn how to deal with mutineers? He should shoot them where they stand. The rest of the regiment was ordered to parade with loaded muskets. The insubordinate companies were offered the choice of instant death or instant submission. The men knew their commander and at once surrendered. This, says Dabney, was the last attempt at organised disobedience in the Valley Army. Chapter 10. Winchester, 1862, May. That week in May, when the Army of the Valley marched back to the Shenandoah, was almost the darkest in the Confederate annals. The Northern armies, improving daily in discipline and in efficiency, had attained an ascendancy which it seemed impossible to withstand. In every quarter of the theatre of war, success inclined to the Stars and Stripes. At the end of April, New Orleans, the commercial metropolis of the South, had fallen to the Federal Navy. Earlier in the month, a great battle had been fought at Shiloh in Tennessee. One of the most trusted of the Confederate commanders had been killed. His troops, after a gallant struggle, had been repulsed with fearful losses, and the upper portion of the Mississippi, from the source to Memphis, had fallen under the control of the invader. The wave of conquest, vast and irresistible, swept up every navigable river of the South. And if in the West only the outskirts of her territory were threatened with destruction, in Virginia the roar of the rising waters was heard at the very gates of Richmond. McClellan, with 112,000 men, had occupied West Point at the head of the York River, and on May 16th his advance reached the White House on the Pamunkey, 20 miles from the Confederate capital. McDowell, with 40,000 men, although still north of the Rappahannock, was but 5 short marches distant. First, General A.S. Johnston. 2 directly. McClellan closed in on Richmond. McDowell was ordered, as soon as Shields should join him, to march from Manassas to his assistance. Lincoln and Stanton had recovered confidence when Jackson returned to the valley from Meckham Station. The Federal gunboats were steaming up the James, and Johnston's army, encamped outside the city, was menaced by thrice its numbers. So black was the situation that military stores had already been removed from the capital, the archives of the Confederacy had been packed, and Mr. Davis had made arrangements for the departure of his family. In spite of the protests of the Virginia people, the government had decided to abandon Richmond. The General Assembly addressed a resolution to the President requiring him to defend the city, if necessary, until not a stone was left upon another. The City Council, enthusiastically supported by the citizens, seconded the appeal. A deputation was sent to Mr. Davis, but while they conferred together, a messenger rode in with the news that the mastheads of the Federal fleet could be seen from the neighbouring hills. Davis dismissed the committee, saying, "This manifestly concludes the matter." The gunboats, however, had still to feel their way up the winding reaches of the James. Their progress was very slow. There was time to obstruct the passage, and batteries were hastily improvised. The people made a mighty effort, and on the commanding heights of Drury's Bluff, 6 miles below the city, might be seen senators and merchants, bankers and clergymen, digging parapets and hauling timber, in company with parties of soldiers and gangs of slaves. Heavy guns were mounted. A great boom was constructed across the stream. When the ships approached, they were easily driven back, and men once more breathed freely in the streets of Richmond. The example of the unterrified Commonwealth, as Virginia has been proudly named, inspired the government, and it was determined, come what might, that Richmond should be held. On the land side it was already fortified, but Lee was unwilling to resign himself to a siege. McClellan had still to cross the Chickahominy, a stream which oozes by many channels through treacherous swamps and an unwholesome jungle, and despite the overwhelming numbers of the invading armies, it was still possible to strike an effective blow. Few would have seen the opportunity, or, with a great army thundering at the gates of Richmond, have dared to seize it. But it was not McClellan and McDowell whom Lee was fighting, not the enormous hosts which they commanded, nor the vast resources of the North. The power which gave life and motion to the mighty mechanism of the attack lay not within the camps that could be seen from the housetops of Richmond and from the hills round Fredericksburg. Far away to the north, beyond the Potomac, beneath the shadow of the Capitol at Washington, was the mainspring of the invaders' strength. The multitudes of armed men that overran Virginia were no more the inanimate pieces of the chessboard. The power which controlled them was the Northern president. It was at Lincoln that Lee was about to strike, at Lincoln and the Northern people, and an effective blow at the point which people and president deemed vital might arrest the progress of their armies as surely as if the Confederates had been reinforced by 100,000 men. May 16th. On May 16th, Lee wrote to Jackson, "Whatever movement you make against Banks, do it speedily, and if successful, drive him back towards the Potomac, and create the impression, as far as possible, that you design threatening that line." For this purpose, in addition to Ewell and Johnston's forces, the Army of the Valley was to be reinforced by 2 brigades, Branch's and Mahone's, of which the former had already reached Gordonsville. In this letter, the idea of playing on the fears of Lincoln for the safety of his capital first sees the light, and it is undoubtedly to be attributed to the brain of Lee. That the same idea had been uppermost in Jackson's mind during the whole course of the campaign is proved not only by the evidence of his chief of the staff, but by his correspondence with headquarters. "If Banks is defeated," he had written on April 5th, "it may directly retard McClellan's movements." It is true that nowhere in his correspondence is the idea of menacing Washington directly mentioned, nor is there the slightest evidence that he suggested it to Lee. But in his letters to his superiors he confines himself strictly to the immediate subject, and on no single occasion does he indulge in speculation on possible results. In the ability of the commander-in-chief he had the most implicit confidence. "Lee," he said, "is the only man I know whom I would follow blindfold," and he was doubtless assured that the embarrassments of the federal government were as apparent to Lee as to himself. That the same idea should have suggested itself independently to both is hardly strange. Both looked further than the enemy's camps. Both studied the situation in its broadest bearings. Both understood the importance of introducing a disturbing element into the enemy's plans. And both were aware that the surest means of winning battles is to upset the mental equilibrium of the opposing leader.